I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Mint South to our first technical meeting of this new year. And although we're already almost 2 weeks into the new year, I would still like to wish everyone a happy and, well, first and foremost, healthy New Year 2022. With COP26 just happened a few weeks ago, it's becoming more and more clear, and we can see it every day, that the world and the environment is in a big crisis, and that we have to change our ways of living, and we have to be a little bit smarter about how we produce energy, how we store energy. But whatever we do, we will have to mine resources to transition into a green future. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Richard Herrington of the Natural History Museum here in London. Richard has, I don't know how many years experience as an economic geologist. I think it's several decades working on various commodities pretty much around the globe. But not just from an economic point of view, he's more and more focusing on the environmental impact of mining. And tonight he will be sharing with us his views on how mining will, or what mining will look like in the future, and what we have to do to transition to a green economy. And with that said, I hand over to Richard.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Simon, and thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. Hopefully this won't be too much of a ramble, although when I was assembling the slides, I kind of thought, boy, I'm rambling here. But I think, as Simon said, I've started life as an exploration geologist. I worked for a number of years looking for minerals, and then I moved to become an academic and have been investigating where minerals are found and how can we make the process of finding them, processing them more efficient. But as Simon says, increasingly now, the recognition that we've got to do this in a way that doesn't leave the planet in a worse state than we found it. And actually, there's an enormous challenge to that, and mining is a key part, as Simon said. And I'm going to give you a little bit of hopefully a little wander through where I think the pressures are at the moment, and perhaps where mining should be going and where the future of mining should be. So Simon gave a great intro talking about COP. So I just really wanted to start with looking at the COP26 meeting, which I spent a bit of time at a meeting and contributed to the session that the New York Times ran on the energy transition. But as at COP26, there were four main goals of the COP26 meeting. And you can see number one there is securing global net zero by mid-century 2050. And obviously we know that is all linked to trying to keep climate change under control. And there were other key goals of COP. And the second one there was protecting communities and natural habitats. So that's the people and the planet. And I'm going to come back to that through my talk. But it's clear we've got all four of these. So mobilizing finance, that's obviously outside my brief here, and collaborating to deliver, making sure people work together to make it all happen. But I'm going to really be focusing on those first two there, and just sort of show you how mining is pretty fundamental to those goals. So moving down, there were some agenda items, and they're the 10 agenda items. And I kind of put in red there the ones that are relevant to the minerals industry. And you see it's pretty much, they're all pretty much relevant to the minerals industry. We know that we have to be delivering clean energy. and we know there's a big mining voice in there, and we're going to talk a bit about that later. Sustainable land use. We know we can't leave mines with a detrimental state to the environment, and we've got to be able to be looking at innovative science that can drive us towards the zero emission transport, and that's all kind of locked in. And then the other items in there, meaningful participation by women and girls, getting diversity and inclusivity into it, that runs through everything we do, and obviously in the mining industry too. So I'm going to be talking about what I'm talking about tonight has got great relevance to that COP agenda, even though there was very little spoken about minerals at COP26. And it was a bit of a disappointment, but I think people are waking up to the relevance of minerals. How do I know that? Well, we all know that the biggest driver for minerals is commitment to decarbonising all sectors of the community, because there are technologies linked to that decarbonising that need metals, and we'll talk about that. And the government in October launched this net zero strategy, Build Back Greener. That was launched in October 2021. It actually has minerals mentioned 19 times in it. It's the first time I've seen a document from HM government mention minerals as being a critical part of the delivery of strategy. And as part of that, the government set up a critical minerals expert panel, which I've been invited to join for my sins. But part of that is to make sure, well, with the wake-up call, we wrote a letter in 2019 actually pointing out that it's all very well for Theresa May to say we're going to be net zero by 2050, but do you know what that really means? And at the time, there was nothing written about minerals. Now, with this new document launched last year, there's a lot written about minerals, as I say, 19 times. And even our government have woken up to that fact. So it's good. We're getting traction. People understand that minerals are linked in here. And I'm going to tell you, go on and talk a little bit about where we're going with all of that. So just a quick reminder, biggest thing is the net zero challenge by 2050, got to cut CO2 emissions. So who are the bad guys in the CO2 emitters? Well, you can see here, this is a pie chart from a recent paper. So the big issues are electricity and heating. 42% of the CO2 we produce comes from that. 22% comes from transportation. So if you can wrap up energy generation and transport and get rid of carbon from those, overnight you'll cut 64% of our CO2 emitters. Industry, 21%. Obviously, that's also the mining industry's in there as part of it. Probably about 6% of the energy needs of the planet go into mining, and that will come as long as that electricity is generated by renewables. Then we can get the CO2 down on that. And we know that there's trends in all industry to decarbonize, but it's not as big as these other sectors, as you see. And just to blow the myth away, people say, well, if you make an electric vehicle, surely the making of the electric vehicle uses more CO2 than just by having a cheaper car that is using internal combustion engine. Not true. All the studies suggest that you cut CO2 emissions by 50% by having an electric vehicle, and that's recharged with low CO2 electricity. But that is obviously something that we are moving towards anyway. So going green is definitely a mineral-hungry business. So this chart, which is from an IEA report that came out last year, it puts that into perspective. So at the top there, you've got a bar chart there about transport. If you look at the mineral content of a conventional car, there's quite a bit of copper in there, quite a bit of manganese. So these are the differences of key minerals. All cars, whether they're electric or conventional, will use steel for the frame and so on. But this is focused on the metals where there are significant differences between the conventional and the electric vehicle. And you can see the electric vehicle's got it's got double the amount of copper in it for all the wiring, and then it's got a range of cocktail of all these other metals that are in the batteries, in the drive chain, and mainly it's the batteries there you see. So graphite, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium. And then power generation, if you can look at the bottom there, coal, natural gas, they're quite low users of minerals. But when you look at offshore wind, it's an incredible user of metals and minerals. And you can see a lot of copper and other important metals. And zinc is a big component of those because of galvanizing the steel. But it's not only these rather, should I say, more exotic metals. If we look at bulk commodities, what we might call bulk metals, copper, steel, glass, and aluminium and concrete. The graph here shows coal and gas on the x-axis there on the right-hand side. Very low consumers, because actually building a coal power station, you get a lot of bang for your buck of a building for those types of power. And obviously, if you're building hydro power, there's a lot of concrete in the dams, photovoltaics, the PV1, PV2, and then the wind. You can see there, wind turbines also are using quite a bit of metal, particularly steel and concrete and aluminium. And it just reflects the fact that wind turbines are mainly metal. So, nearly 5 tons of copper in your average 3 megawatt wind turbine, more than 1,000 tons of concrete, lots of steel, aluminium, and other metals, as I said, like zinc, molybdenum, and rare earths. So we can see in there that's just the straight decarbonising and the move to renewable energy and decarbonising transport is increasing our use of metals. And this graph here, which is from a World Bank document that was published in 2020, actually shows the estimated increasing demand for a range of metals. There's actually an IEA report came out later last year, which is even less. Well, this is conservative in comparison to the IEA report, but we can use this one because it's got a lot of very good tested data in there. But you can see there's a growth in demand for a range of metals, graphite, lithium, cobalt, all 500% increases in those metals. But there's a range of others, indium, vanadium, nickel, silver, all the way down, even aluminium, zinc, and copper in there. The bars look small, so the percentage increase might actually be in single figures. But if you convert that into tons of metal, millions of tons of metal, you can see for aluminium, it's quite enormous, and it's not insignificant for nickel, copper, and zinc. So there's a cocktail of metals, and it is not only these critical metals. We seem to get a little bit focused on the critical metals, but it's all metals, and building the infrastructure is going to need all of those. So the critical metals and materials are all of these. And we see a lot of news in the newspapers and so on saying, let's have a circular economy. Why can't we just recycle what we've got? And the question of can't we just recycle? No, it isn't enough. This graph here, which I've constructed using figures published data, what you have is the metals along the bottom and graphite. Obviously, graphite isn't a metal, but it's a commodity that's of equal import. What I'm showing there in orange is the percentage of each of those commodities that is recycled at the end of its life, its end of its use. So you can see there the orange bars for things like titanium, chromium, and iron, they're pretty high. We recycle a lot of those metals. They go back into the supply chain. But in blue there, that bar shows you the percentage of the current demand that is satisfied by that recycled metal. So you can see with titanium, even with 90% recycling, that only accounts for 50% of the demand. And we all know what that is. It's growth. There's a growth in use. And so even if we got 100% recycling, there would not be there would be a need to get more materials into the supply chain. And then there's quite a few commodities there that you see where currently recycling is really bad. Graphite, lithium, vanadium. We're very poor at recovering those. Even indium is not very well recycled, and so it's even worse for those commodities because there is currently no recycled material available. So it's a wonderful premise to have a circular economy, and we would all aspire to move towards that. But at the moment, we're not going to do that. And here's some data, actually, again, from this IEA report published last year. And if this is future forecasting of when those metals and materials might be available for recycling. And you can see it's only really at about 2040, you start to see the batteries that are being made today will start to get back in the recycling chain. So it will take about 10, 15 years before batteries will come to the end of their lives, if they're made properly. And it's only at that point where you then get those raw materials back into the recycle chain. What that isn't talking about, though, is by 2040, it may be that we're not going to be using the same chemistry of batteries. Because a lot of people say, well, if we can't find these metals, why don't we just substitute something else? Well, we all know industry is quite conservative. The choices have been made. The cars that are being manufactured now have got cobalt, lithium, iron batteries. And so we're committed to those technologies. But by 2040, maybe there will be substitution. But that still won't get us to that point if we don't have those commodities now for the proven technologies. So it's only by about 2040 where we start to see things like the recycling get even up to 9%. If you have a look on the right-hand graph there, on the right-hand side there, the red dot in each of the graphs is showing us the amount of the share of the total demand that's coming from recycling for battery metals. At the moment, it's minuscule, below 1%. But by 2040, it might be getting up to 9 or 10%. So it's still going to be a problem. But as I say, substitution might start to kick in at that point. So what we know is that recycling will not supply all that is needed. And this is a nice diagram that EIT Raw Materials put together. It shows that we can aspire to a circular economy. And for iron and for titanium, for example, we recycle more than 90% of the metals, but we still have to stock in new mined titanium at the top. So the circular economy is rather like this symbol here of a delta symbol, basically, that you're still going to have to be fueling that in. Even when we get to total recycling, we know there's going to be waste because you never get 100% recovery. There's always going to be problems in production. People will throw stuff into waste that should be recycled. So currently recycling, the aspirations of having recycling covering everything until well into the 2050s is probably very difficult to imagine. And then underlying all of that, we've got this increase in demand for particular new technologies, but world economic growth is also driving increased demand. And this graph here from the World Bank shows this was the rate of growth in up to 2015, published in 2019. I know COVID has, and that's the first time and the only time I'm going to mention COVID tonight, I think. But COVID has slowed this down, but we're emerging on the other side. Economies are growing. China, huge population, with economic growth, that will grow demand. And you can see quite a bit of Africa is also growing. And, even parts of Europe are growing at reasonable paces, 2 to 3%. So that in itself, with a population that is not decreasing, that will drive increased demand. So I think we've finally persuaded everybody that more mining is definitely needed. But the big thing, the next part of the talk I'm going to get into is where are we going to get those metals from? And I shall spend the next part of the talk, the rest of the talk, talking about that. So there's two ways we could do that. We get worried about security of supply, so we could secure watertight arrangements to secure and expand the current supplies, or we could diversify by new and more widely distributed deposits that could feed into it. And here's some data for you to consider. This is again from the IEA report, and it shows you the percentage of production for the top three producing areas for each of the commodities shown on the screen. So if we have a look at oil and natural gas, everybody thinks that oil and gas has been subject to monopolies and people who can manipulate the market. But you can see the top three producers only account for about 40% of the world production of oil and gas. Whereas we go down into some of the metals, we can see the top producing areas. I mean, people pay for cobalt, the DRC, that's well known. But for China, graphite, rare earths, Australia for lithium, and South Africa for platinum. So we can see that there's real opportunity here for supply to get manipulated on political grounds. And if we actually look at processed metals, again from the IEA report, that's even more extreme when we get to there, because quite a lot of stuff that it might be mined somewhere else, but it is actually being processed in another country. So for nickel, where China's not a huge producer, it's a huge refiner because it's bought assets overseas that control that supply. And if you look for lithium, although China doesn't mine very much lithium, it refines a lot of the lithium, including all of that from Australia. And you can see for copper, Chile is a really big producer, but China's a much bigger refiner. So we have, if we are going to go to the traditional sources, we've got to make sure we stay friends with those countries that are going to supply those metals. Otherwise, we're in trouble. And there's a really interesting paper that I'm reviewing at the moment that's actually suggesting that better dialogue with countries that supply metals may well be needed, because otherwise we're going to get a squeeze on the supply of the metals we need. So what else can we do to make sure we can get the metals we need? Well, we can extend existing camps where we know that we can mine, and there's some good examples of how exploration has been good. I'm just giving you one example here because it's local, of how in New Boliden have used new technologies to discover brownfield resource in an active mine that is fully permitted. It's working, and people are happy with that mine. And so it's got to be a good way of extending our access to resources, and it's a much lower risk if you can find it, use a new technology, go deeper to extend resources in existing camps. The other thing that we can do is go to new places. Central Asia has been on the radar for quite a while. It promises a lot. It still only attracts a few percent of the world's exploration budget, but the politics of that region are quite tricky. Includes places like Russia and Kazakhstan, both of which at the moment would be quite tricky for people to make big investment decisions on. And so whilst geologically speaking, these are great opportunities, the timeline of getting things from discovery to production becomes an issue. We've got new regions like the polar regions being touted that with climate change, ironically, with climate change, shipping in the northern parts of the world are getting easier. So mines that are in the polar regions, there aren't many. You can see in this diagram on the left-hand side, but there are prospects all the way up right to the north of Greenland, and potentially these could be opening up as ice melts. But there may be environmental issues. If you look on the right, we've got Antarctic mineral potential, which we have there as potential, but pretty much we know that's off limits for new exploration. So they're just to highlight a few new deposits and places where things might be coming from. So there's the deep oceans. This has been touted as a new frontier for places to go and find the metals that we might need. So seafloor sulfides were looked at quite recently, up until quite recently, Solwara, as you remember, but effectively that company went insolvent. There have been all kinds of issues there. There's still big questions about environment. Deep ocean nodules and crusts. These are actually, these have got phenomenal resources. So both in the, for these cobalt crusts, which are poorly tested, but Japanese are spending a lot of time looking in the Pacific at these. But more well known, perhaps, is the polymetallic nodules, like the ones in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And actually, if we look at the resources of those, and these are estimated resources, in the Clarion-Clipperton zone alone, there's an estimated 21 billion tons of nodules that contain more than 1.3 nickel, over 1% copper, and quite a bit of cobalt. So you can see it could actually answer the world's issue with regard to cobalt production, and a large amount of copper and as much manganese as you will need for hundreds of years. And then finally, I just throw this in more to get a laugh than anything else, is that people have been talking about mining asteroids, and so if we wait till 2069, asteroid KU2 will come within 10 million kilometers of the Earth, and has $80 trillion worth of metal on board. By 2069, maybe we will be able to harness some of that. But I mean, that is a long time in the future. And this is one of the problems about greenfield supply. And those of you who are in the mining industry will understand this diagram, that long lead times for discovery, exploration towards feasibility. The average here from 2010 to 19 was 12.5 years. And then you add on top of that construction, planning, and production, which is quite a bit shorter, obviously, but even that can take 5 years. We've got to go to net zero by 2050. We can't afford to have long lead times. Actually, for some of these, like the lithium deposits in Australia, that only took 4 years to get from discovery, really, to getting into production, because it was an extension to a known mineralized camp. The lithium deposits in South America, once the decision had been made, it didn't take too long to get the first production out. But you can see it's increasingly more complex as we get into mines that need complex permitting and technologies that need to be tested. So anything up to 20 years to get a nickel laterite into production. So, one of the things that is holding up that lead time is when this ESG is done wrong. And the thing that came out of COP this last year was the E part of social governance, of ESG, is being highlighted more towards biodiversity. So in the past, environmental has meant, toxicity, windborne dust, and sort of impact to the, if you like, the environment, but very little focus towards the impact on biodiversity. And COP26 has really made that now a headline item. We had a meeting with an asset management group yesterday, and they were really interested. Industry is really interested in getting metrics that they can put onto biodiversity change that will enable them to then scope projects and understand how the impact of one project vies up against the impact of another. And so a group at the museum have been working on looking at biodiversity, and they've worked on a score they call biodiversity intactness. And so this is a diagram that was published actually in the IPBES report, but generated by our scientists, which is looking at how intact is biodiversity in different parts of the world. Basically here, if a place is blue, it's pretty intact. So that blue means it's pristine. So you can see places where people don't live, and we haven't been, are generally blue because the biodiversity is intact. The red is the zones where biodiversity is not intact, and this is where the the impact of humans has been highest. And so this is a major consideration. So if you have a look at some of the places you might want to go to explore, you can see they might well be in some of the blue and green areas where biodiversity is more intact. And with the current emphasis now on reducing the impact on biodiversity, it makes some of those wilderness areas even less attractive to start to do exploration. And on top of that are things like water. So this is another diagram from the IEA report about the criticality index of water. And just put on there is the occurrence of copper mines and lithium mines, both of which need a lot of water. And you can see it becomes then a problem. And maybe it then draws you to saying, well, we should perhaps start to look for copper mines where water isn't an issue. And, you know, Central Africa is pretty good for that point of view, that water isn't critical. So we've got big copper production in an area with low impact on water, whereas up in the Andes, there's a big impact on water. And likewise, lithium, if you can find lithium in a temperate zone, the problem of water goes away. So the debate about where those new minerals that we need should come from is very complex. But, you know, society is going to have to choose because there's no alternative. We've already said there's no alternative if we want to hit the climate change targets. And so we have people saying, oh, let's not do deep sea mining. We should do alternative technologies on terrestrial mines. Then we have people saying, no, can't do work on terrestrial areas. We have to find a way of being able to do it. And for the very last part of my talk, just a few more slides. And one of the things I promoted in a recent paper, and I'll give you the reference at the end, is maybe we should start looking for minerals closer to home. And actually, this comes from a presentation I made in 2013 at PDAC. And I basically, at that, we had a whole meeting that was dedicated to new materials from the old world, new minerals from the old world, and trying to sort of say to the world that, you know, Europe has been a big producer of metals and it could become a bigger producer of metals still. And there's even more relevance for that message today, I think. So if we go and have a look at the relative valuation of some famous European ore districts, and I'll just run through these, and you can see that parts of Europe that have been big past producers compare very favourably their valuation of how, you know, and basically the European economy was built on the value of a number of those mining districts. And I think people have forgotten that the wealth and industrial wealth of Europe was built on its indigenous mineral resources. And I just put in some comparators there for some international mining districts of similar values. So this is one example. I'm going to give a couple. Erzgebirge, the so-called ore mountains in Central Europe, big past producer, now has a well-defined lithium potential in addition to producing tin and other metals. And we have southwest England, where we know it was a pre-Roman discovery. It's been working for a number of centuries, and we have some potential there. South Crofty is threatening to reopen. Hemerdon is currently being reopened after an abortive first new launch, and we know of the current activity for lithium. And so what I'm suggesting is some of these districts, we should be encouraging people to go back and have a look. Well, why? Well, actually, mining is looked upon positively in some areas. Interesting story, Cornish Lithium, they did some crowdfunding, fundraising. Within 15 minutes, they'd raised 6 million, which was the limit to how much they could raise by their shareholder agreement. And it was incredible. And it was all local people buying into Cornish Lithium. And you go down there, people are very positive towards getting a new mining industry going. We know Kiruna in northern Sweden, when the option was the mine closes or we move the town, people voted to move the town 2 miles away. So there are places where people like new mining. But we know it's less welcome elsewhere. And the the story on the left-hand side there, which came at the end of last year, was Rio Tinto seemed to be at the sharp end of people protesting about mining in Serbia. And we know there's places all around Europe that have similar issues. But there's potential in old mine wastes, but it's still not enough for our need. We are going to have new mines. So how do we do it? We have to make sure that once we decide to do mining, we do the mining right. And we talked about ESG very briefly. I'm not going to talk in any detail, but our new ways of mining have to be less impactful and net positive. So there's a diagram there from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is to try and make both our industrial and our biological world both circular. So that actually, this is an interesting example, the Flambeau mine in Wisconsin, where mining went on, the minerals were extracted, and the place has gone back, it's been regenerated, it's actually now an asset, and people are back fishing in the river. So we need to develop that concept so that the mine produces what it needs for its profit and for its people, but also ends up with something that is a reconstructed ecosystem. And I'm using this term cradle to cradle, which I shall end on and explaining what that is. But rather than have a cradle to a mine ending up being a grave, it should then be a site that is ready for the next user. And I think it means that we have to kind of revolutionize the way mining workflow is structured. And at the moment, mining projects seem to be too readily divided into separate business units of the exploration, which we know is always loss-making, so there's a pressure to reduce the cost of exploration. And they get to the project stage, and people's fascination there is to raise the value of stocks. And it's only at the operation stage, this is where the profits are being generated. And so the driver there is to make sure the mine is as profitable as it can be. And I won't use the word milk dry, but potentially you've got to suck out all the profit you can from it. And then, of course, you're left at the end with a closure legacy. And I think the whole thing should be thought about much more as in unity, so that when you get in the exploration stage, the better you can do your exploration to understand what the problems might be on closure, the better you're going to be. And so I would say that mining projects currently are too readily divided into these individual business units without recourse to one another. And what I'm going to suggest here is it follows a book that I read last year and got. Actually, I picked this up when I went to the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, when I met William McDonough. This concept of cradle to cradle, because mining projects should be following that principle, because mines are essential but temporary interventions. You know, mines come to an end, and so effectively we only lease that part of the real estate to mine. Therefore, we should be designing that mine with the inherent regeneration built in for the next leaseholder. Those of you who ever leased a flat, when you come to the end of the loan of the flat, you have to redecorate it or pay for have it redecorated for the next person to come in. Well, that's the equivalent of mine closure. But if you looked after the flat while you lived in it, you wouldn't have that legacy at the end. And it's that kind of approach that I think we need. And so the projects themselves should be creating a net positive outcome for the people and the planet while they're mined, and then we can return those back. And then people will get to understand we can get the value out of the ground, but it doesn't need to leave a bad legacy for the planet. So, final slide, takeaway messages. So there's a clear need to mine this increased volume of metals, but this new sourcing must be done in a way that there's a net positive impact for people and the planet. Optimized recycling and use of waste are a key component, but it's not enough. So mining is inevitable. It's for society to choose where that will happen. And I'm suggesting actually it's prudent to source at least some of our new metals closer to home, because we can generate old districts where maybe the metal is sitting there that just hasn't been mined, like lithium in Erzgebirge and Cornwall. They were there, but nobody needed them before. We can go back and find those. So a lot of those sort of energy critical metals may be there, in deposits that have not been fully exploited. And I'd say if the ESG could be done correctly in those local areas, it could drive other social and economic benefits. Look at Cornwall; they benefit a lot from being associated with mining. And if it's done right, you can localize downstream industry, you can clean up environmental legacies, and positively impact biodiversity. So the most impacted sites biodiversity-wise on the planet are where we live. So actually a mine in Cornwall could potentially improve biodiversity, because if you built in the right kind of post-mining legacy, you could be upping the very low level of intactness higher. So rather than go and degrade an area of high intactness, why don't you improve an area of low intactness? So that's another consideration if biodiversity is going to be a big driver. And then lastly, building stronger supply chains. Local materials mean we're less at the mercy of people who might want to control supply. So I'll mercilessly point you to this paper that I wrote May last year, which encapsulates some of the philosophy of what I've just spoken. So I realise I've gone on for quite a while, but I hope it hasn't been too boring, and it wasn't as much of a ramble as I fear it might be. So thank you very much.